So we move on now to poems written by Du Fu. Now, even though Li Bai is a very important poet, and some would argue that he is the greatest Chinese poet, the greater consensus would point to Du Fu as the most important, as the highest of the Tang poets, and therefore of all Chinese poetry. There is a bit of a dispute between these, but as I say, most of the time Du Fu is the winner. You could say that his poetry is generally more serious than Li Bai's. It represents more the interests of the scholar officials, because Du Fu was a scholar official, a frustrated one, but a scholar official after all. There is a great of social commentary, social criticism in his poetry at the abuses of the rich, which is something that, and of power, which is something that readers today tend to appreciate. He is a master craftsman, and he is able to work in one of the most difficult, formal, and most regulated forms of poetry in the Chinese tradition, which is the Liu Xi, the regulated poem of the Tang dynasty. This is not one of those, but we will see examples of his later on. And he is a master of the use of the couplet and of the use of quotations. Now, a lot of classical Chinese poetry tends to abuse intertextuality and quotations. Some poems feel as a patchwork of different quotes. And this, along with parallelism, can make a poem feel very artificial, but Du Fu's best works never feel so. They use a lot of formal constraints, and they would have used more in the original Chinese version, but they always feel spontaneous, fluid, natural. And the intertextualities, the references always seem to fit properly in the context and not to be just there for the purpose of decoration. Okay, so little more to say about the poet himself, about Du Fu. He was from the capital area, from Shangan, and his relatives had held posts in, his ancestors had been ministers and poets during the Tang Dynasty. He tried several times to pass the Jinshi examinations and was unsuccessful. He still managed, though, to get some lower level posts thanks to his aristocratic upbringing. But he wasn't very successful in neither of those. He was recognized for his literary quality. At the time of the Anlushan rebellion in 755, when the country was devastated and the dynasty almost brought to its knees by a barbarian and rebellion in the north, which sacked the two capitals and sent the emperor into exile for some years. After this major crisis, Tu Fu started wandering around. First, he served in some minor posts, and then he wandered around the country, first to the west in Sichuan, and afterwards following the course of the of the Huang River Valley, where he wrote some of his best and most pessimistic poetry, dying in the lower ranges of the Jiangzi near the lakes region in what would be historically Chu. So after this introduction, let's go on with this poem, which is quite a short one, and it's called Gazing at Mount Tai, and it goes as follows. How to describe Mount Tai? Its green towers above all of Qi and Lu. Here, nature concentrated divine beauty. Its north and south sides split dark from dawn. Chest pounding, you reach the birthplace of clouds. Bursting eyes fill with birds returning to nest. Someday I must climb to the very top. Look down on all the little mountains at once. So here we have what looks like, I think that's the main meaning of it, it's a landscape poem. I ignore the circumstances or the context in which it was written, but this is a poem commemorating a famous mountain in China. This mountain is Mount Tai. So let's say a few things about this mountain. I've already mentioned how mountains were sacred for the Chinese. They were spaces of the sacred, which tended to collect a great variety of hermits, Taoist hermits, and Buddhist temples. Even before Buddhism and Taoism coalesced into a religion, mountains were already sacred places in China, and we can read in some very ancient texts or in later texts that refer to previous texts like the Shanghai Jing, the importance of mountains as, axis mundi, connecting earth with heaven. Chinese thought traditionally gave a special pride of place to five mountains, the five mountains of the four directions of the compass plus the center. And out of these five mountains, probably the most important and the most talked about is Mount Tai. Now, Mount Tai was the great mountain in the east. But in spite of being in the east, it was in a rather central position. It was in the modern province of Shandong. In fact, Shandong means east of the mountain, east of this mountain, of the Tai mountain, and the province to its west is called Shanxi, which is west of the mountain. So it's located in the lower Yellow River Valley. It's also close to Honan, where one of the historical capitals of Imperial China, Luoyang, was close by. So Mount Tai was the most important of these mountains of the world, at least practically. It received a lot of sacrifices, rituals, imperial visits. So the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, visited it once or twice, as did the greatest emperor of the Western Han Dynasty, Han Wudi. And they both performed the famous Feng and Shang sacrifices in that mountain, asking for immortality. So Mount Tai is no ordinary mountain. It's the most splendorous, one of the biggest, and one of the most sacred peaks of China. And according to some legends, it was one of the pillars of the world, or had been one of the pillars that sustained the heavens, the heavenly vault. So here we have, as I say, a landscape poem, and let's dissect it part by part. So the first couplet starts with the difficulty. The poetic persona of Du Fu manifests, if not the impossibility, at least the challenge of describing such a momentous mountain. How to describe Mount Tai? Its green towers above all of Qi and Lu. So we have a majestuous, gigantic mountain, difficult to describe, and its green colors, its green vegetation, towers above all of Qi and Lu. Qi and Lu were two of the old feudal states of the area. So even a pair of big feudal states are humbled, are made small by the big size of Mount Tai. Second couplet, here nature concentrates divine beauty. Its north and south sides split dark from dawn. So this mountain, even though it's difficult to describe, who is going to make an attempt? And the first two things he says are, first, it's a beautiful spot. Nature has concentrated all of its beauty, all of its divine beauty, because remember, mountains are sacred. All of its divine beauty is concentrated here. And it's so high, it's so tall, that, you can see dawn from the north side, while the south side is still in darkness, because the mountain is high enough to hide the sun, to blot out the morning sun. Third couplet, and now in the third and fourth couplets there is a move from the generic descriptive to the subjective. Now the poetic persona makes his personal appearance in the text. Chest pounding, you reach the birthplace of clouds. Bursting eyes fill with birds returning to nest. So this is a wonderful pair of parallelistic verses. Chest pounding, reach birthplace clouds, eyes bursting, fill, birds return nest. So we have aerial images. The poet is climbing up the mountain. It's so incredibly high and aerial that the place you've reached is the birthplace, the place where clouds are born. And your eyes also bulge at seeing probably great amounts of birds that are coming to nest in such a high place. The fourth couplet, brings us to the conclusion, to the message, if you will, or the message the poetic persona formulates after seeing the mountain. Someday I must climb to the very top, look down on all the little mountains at once. So it's hard to climb to the top. The mountain is very high. But I think there's something else at play here. So we talked about the sacredness of mountains, but they also have a metaphorical meaning, which is very present usually in medieval Chinese poetry. Mountains are high, and from their height one can contemplate a vast and faraway view. Now, this extension of sight is generally played upon metaphorically, both in political texts from the Warring States period and afterwards, and in poetic texts. So the extension of sight, which being high in a mountain provides, is equated with the far sight, which is a very meaningful English word, far sight, which is not related to seeing with one's eyes, but seeing with one's intelligence, with one's mind. And climbing a mountain and seeing afar is also connected to this Anglo-Saxon view of far sight. Mountains are places not only for seeing the landscape, but for experiencing the influence of the sacred, and for, with the help possibly of that sacred influence, being able to see further, to see the truth, to see reality in a greater depth than can be seen from lower positions. And, this goes along politically as well. The idea that the wise statesman or minister is in a high place, and his high place allows him to see beyond what petty men with petty sights and petty interests can see. So the metaphor of seeing from on high reflects knowledge, higher knowledge for people who are in a higher position. Emperors liked being in high places, and first emperors were notorious for building high palaces, high towers, terraces, and towers on terraces, from which they could see everything without being seen themselves. A model that rings very familiar with European ideas of the panopticon, yeah? Seeing without being seen. So when the poet wants to look down on all the little mountains at once, he is experiencing, or he is hoping to experience, something that is not exactly the sublime aesthetic of the Romantics when they climbed mountains, but rather more an intellectual, philosophical, I will know all and see all from the vantage point. It's a nice little poem, quite short. Most of Du Fu's next poems that we will be reading will be a bit longer, and we'll continue with more Du Fu next day.